We've met King Ahasuerus, a pretty useless king. And we've met Mordecai, the faithful Jew, trying to figure out how to live life faithfully in a pagan empire. And we've met his adopted daughter, his cousin Esther. And we've seen how she's kept her identity as a Jew secret. And partly because of that, and partly because of her great beauty, she has found herself queen of the entire Persian Empire. And we have met Haman, the Jew hater. And last time we were here, we saw how Haman manipulated the king, or rather the king all too easily gave up his power to Haman, so that Haman might execute a plan to organize the eradication of the Jewish race from the Persian Empire. We saw that in contrast to Mordecai, how Mordecai had saved the king's life from an assassination attempt and had got no reward, and yet Haman, who seems to have every bit of luck come his way, found himself in a position to arrange for the murder of an entire race of people. Not only any race, but God's covenant people, through whom the Messiah, the one who would crush the serpent's head, the one promised in Genesis 3:15, would come. And so the stakes are high as we come to Esther chapter 4. When Mordecai learned all that had occurred, he tore his clothes, he put on sackcloth and ashes, he went into the middle of the city and he cried loudly and bitterly. He went only as far as the king's gate, since the law prohibited anyone wearing sackcloth from entering through the king's gate. And there was great mourning among the whole of the Jewish people in every province where the king's command and edict had reached. They fasted and wept and lamented, and many lay in sackcloth and ashes. Esther's female servants and her eunuchs came, reported the news to her, and the queen was overcome with fear. She sent clothes for Mordecai to wear so that he would take off his sackcloth, but he did not accept them. And so Esther summoned Hathach, one of the king's eunuchs who attended her, and dispatched him to Mordecai to learn what he was doing and why. So Hathach went out to Mordecai in the city square in front of the king's gate. Mordecai told him everything that had happened, as well as the exact amount of money that Haman had promised to pay the royal treasury for the slaughter of the Jews. Mordecai also gave Hathach a copy of the written decree issued in Susa ordering their destruction, so that Hathach might show it to Esther, explain it to her, and command her to approach the king, implore his favor, and plead with him personally for her people. Hathach came and repeated all Mordecai's response to Esther. Esther spoke to Hathach and commanded him to tell Mordecai, "All the royal officials and the people of the royal provinces know that one law applies to every man or woman who approaches the king in the inner courtyard and who has not been summoned: the death penalty, unless the king extends the gold scepter, allowing that person to live. And I have not been summoned to appear before the king for the last 30 days. Esther's response was reported to Mordecai. Mordecai told the messenger to reply to Esther, "Don't think that you will escape the fate of all the Jews because you're in the king's palace. If you keep silent at this time, relief and deliverance will come to the Jewish people from another place, but you and your father's family will be destroyed. Who knows? Perhaps you've come to your royal position for such a time as this." So Esther sent this reply to Mordecai: "Go, assemble all the Jews who can be found in Susa and fast for me. Don't eat or drink for 3 days, night or day. I and my female servants will also fast in the same way. Then after that I will go to the king, even if it is against the law. And if I perish, I perish." So Mordecai went and did everything Esther had commanded him. This is the word of the Lord to us this morning. We're diving right into a conversation. Really, it's 3 conversations between Mordecai and Esther, communicated via the assistant Hathach, who really got his steps in on his Fitbit that day, running between Esther in the palace, in the citadel, and Mordecai out in the city square. And so we're just going to work through these verses and trust that the Lord is going to speak to us this morning through his word. In verse 1, we see Mordecai the Jew, and Queen Esther's adoptive father taking a desperate move. All these evil machinations, these plans between Haman, the Jew hater, and King Ahasuerus had gone on behind Mordecai's back. He had no idea this was going on. He's been out of the picture on all of it. And it started, if you remember, with the betrayal of his work colleagues. It's all been done behind the scenes. And the first thing that Mordecai hears about it is when this law is issued publicly across the empire, and we're told specifically in the fortress of Susa, where he worked at the king's gate. Can't imagine, you try and put yourself in Mordecai's position for a moment, try and imagine what this must have been like to be standing at his post in work, showing up as usual for his working day, a loyal servant of the king for many years. Remember, he saved the king's life, and this new law is announced. On the 13th day of Adar, the 12th month, just under a year's time, the people are permitted, in fact they are commanded, to annihilate all the Jewish people, young and old, women and children, and to plunder their possessions. A legal requirement that you do so, that there would be no Jews remaining by the following day. And assume that Mordecai has learnt this at the same time as everyone else. No one had given him a heads up. And we realise also in that moment, Queen Esther has absolutely no idea that any of this is happening. She has no idea that this is going on, what Haman and Ahasuerus have been plotting against Mordecai and the Jews. And Mordecai's there, and in his grief he tears his clothes and he puts on sackcloth and ashes, signs of repentance and mourning, signs of lamenting, a way of expressing grief. It was common in the Bible. We read other places in Scripture where people put on sackcloth and ashes and mourn or lament. But it was also common just in the cultures of that day. So the Persians, the members of the citizens of Susa would have known exactly what Mordecai was doing here. It would have meant the same thing to them. Lament and prayer and desperation. And again, God isn't explicitly mentioned here, is he? Remember, God is not mentioned at all in the book of Esther. But it's clear, I think, that the Mordecai's response is one made out of some kind of faith in Yahweh. That it is some sort of expression of desperation. It's a public display. He goes out into the middle of the city, and he cries out loudly and he cries out bitterly. Mordecai wanted all the citizens of Susa to know that something terrible had happened. A protest at this irrevocable law. An uncontrollable outburst of grief. Was he being wise or unwise? Again, in the book of Esther, we're so often not told how to think about the actions of our characters. We're sometimes not even told their motivations, why they came to do what they do. And so we don't pass judgment easily on these characters. We don't know whether this was a good or a bad idea. It certainly scared Esther when she found out what he was doing. But Mordecai is this passionate man, broken by injustice, broken by the idea that his people across the whole empire were to be massacred. Hundreds and thousands of people? I don't know how many Jews were in the empire. Maybe more than 1 million. That's perfectly possible. And perhaps Mordecai realizes as well that he in part is responsible for this. Remember, he wouldn't bow down to Haman, which was the king's command. He wouldn't show any deference to Haman, his enemy. If only he had chosen to do so. Mordecai's own death day has been set, and Esther's too. Got less than a year before their people will be murdered in the streets by their pagan friends and neighbours. Imagine knowing the exact day that you're going to die and the awful circumstances with which your life will be taken. It's hard to imagine, isn't it? Perhaps people in war zones, and maybe they get something close to trying to picture and understand that in order to be able to cope. But every one of the Jews in the empire soon know there is a day where if they don't naturally die before, they will be murdered. And on top of that, remember, this edict issued by Haman in the king's name reminds us that there is a war going on in the spiritual realm, that this isn't simply a story to be told out of interest, but it is telling us that something deeper is going on in the spiritual realm, a spiritual battle. We thought last week how this is a satanic plot to see God's covenant people wiped out of existence, so that God's promise to bless the whole world through a descendant of Eve and a descendant of Abraham, ultimately the Messiah, God's king, who would come and save the world. Well, Satan does not want that to happen. And so this move is a spiritual one, something happening in the spiritual realm to prevent that from happening. And so anyway, Mordecai's there in the public, in the public square, flat out and broken, visible in his grief. The kind of thing that if it was happening on Queen Street in Cardiff or at the bus stop outside Philly Castle, you would cross the road as quick as you could and try and avoid it. Mordecai is making quite the display. And we're told in verse 2 why he was doing this in the city. He wasn't allowed to go into the citadel where he worked. If you were wearing sackcloth, you were not allowed to come up through the king's gate. And so he's standing outside there, and normally perhaps he would be there dressed in the uniform of the king's guard as he kept watch, but now his own work colleagues are there making sure that he doesn't do anything stupid and try and get through the door. Maybe they too realized the part that they had to play in this, because they were the ones in verse 4 of chapter 3 that we read betrayed him to Haman. Perhaps that's why he picked that spot. The blood was as much on their hands as anyone else's. Maybe this restriction of Mordecai to come through through the gate and into the citadel was a picture of the situation that the Jews were facing. Mourning, separation, brokenness, draped in death, standing outside of the king's presence, the king's grace. It should have been impossible to ignore, especially as we see in verse 3 that Mordecai was not the only one grieving in this way, but actually across the whole of the empire, Jews were responding in this way. We're also told in verse 3, we're reminded this was the king's command and edict that they were responding to. I've mentioned it already, but let's remember that Haman came up with the idea. Haman was the one in whose heart bitterness was stirred up. He may have planted the seeds of destruction. He may have set the date, written the edict, offered to cover the costs, ensure the letter was translated and transported to every corner of the empire, but the blame still lays at the king's feet. It was the king who abdicated his responsibility, who gave Haman this power in the first place. And so Mordecai is not alone there. The whole of the Jewish people across the empire fast and weep and lament because their king has turned against them. An entire people weeping and crying out in front of the very ones who were legally obliged to kill them in just a few months' time. The end of chapter 3 in verse 15 we read this. The city was in confusion. The king and Haman are up in the palace having a drink, but the whole of the city is in confusion. Well, now we see the whole empire was. Who would have seen this as a good idea? Who wants to be told to murder their neighbor? These are the deepest and darkest recesses of the human heart, aren't they? To murder, to kill, to dehumanize, to destroy and undo what God has done. This is the chaos. This is sin. This is the chaos that reigns spiritually against God's good creation. It's the goal of evil. It's the goal of sin is the decreation of God's good creation. And so in these ways we understand, and we see it in the world today as when sin it seems to be let loose, running rampage. We realize that anything that looks to seek to destroy and bring chaos and tear down what God has made good, especially when it comes to removing the humanity from those that God has given the dignity of his image, it is all anti-Christ. It is all anti-God. That's what's going on here. In verse 4, Queen Esther re-enters the story. She's been quiet for a while. She's been the queen for 5 years by this point. And it sounds like she's pretty separated from what's going on in the real world. But now's her chance to shine, right? So the time for us to see who she really is and what she's really made of. And yet we see in verse 4 that first, and we can sympathize with this, I'm sure, her overwhelming reaction is fear. Why? Because her female servants and her eunuchs have come and reported the news to her. What's the news they've reported? Well, I don't think it's the news that all the Jews are going to be wiped out. I think it's the news that Mordecai has gone crazy. Back in chapter 2, Just to remind ourselves, verse 19 and 20, we didn't look at these last week, but we were reminded there. When the virgins were gathered a second time, that's those who were in the king's harem, gathered a second time, Mordecai was sitting at the king's gate. Esther still did not reveal her family background or her ethnicity, as Mordecai had directed. She obeyed Mordecai's orders, as she always had while he brought her up. So it is still a secret, even to the king, that Esther is a Jew. And perhaps the source of her fear then in verse 4 is if Mordecai has really lost it and his behavior comes to the attention of the king, then it might be game over for her as well anyway. The fact that she was still a secret Jew, well, that was an offense deserving death. You remember how the king, on a whim, banished his first queen, Vashti, just because she would refuse to come and dance naked for his mates, and he lost his temper and said never want to see her again. How would he respond to 5 years of deception from the queen who he loved? So she's worried, I think, that Mordecai is going to blow her cover, and she hastily sends some clothes for him to wear so that he can take off the sackcloth, clean himself up, stop this public display. So one of her attendants packs a rucksack of clean clothes, sneaks out of the citadel, tries to convince Mordecai, for Esther's sake, Mordecai, calm down. Get dressed before this gets out of hand. Mordecai, what does he do? He outright refuses, doesn't he? Sends the clothes back. Why doesn't Esther understand the seriousness of the matter? Is she too good for him now? Has she lost touch with her people since becoming queen? Of course, she didn't know anything really yet. So in verse 5, she dispatches Hathach, another great name in this book full of great names, dispatches Hathach, her most reliable and trusted attendant, to try and understand what has got into Mordecai, what's going on. And so that's his message to bring to Mordecai. What are you doing and why are you doing it? Verse 6, Hathach finds Mordecai in his little protest camp that he's set up in the city square in front of the city gate. And Mordecai explains to him, well, actually, Hathach, here's what's happened. You need to tell Esther this. It's okay if you privileged folk hold up in the palace. Live in your charmed lives. But have you really not heard a thing about the king's latest law? A law and edict that every Jew in the kingdom must be annihilated. A day chosen at the end of the year for us to be wiped out. And Haman is the brains behind it all, and he even bankrolled it 345 tons of silver so that the king wouldn't be out of pocket. How could you not have heard this? How could Esther not have heard this? How could she be so detached from reality? Mordecai's even, we're told, obtained a copy of one of the letters. How did he get that? Well, I wonder. If I was Haman, I'd have wanted Mordecai to be the one announcing this in the citadel. I'd have put the letter in his hand to announce it himself. I wonder how, I'm totally guessing there. But there's a little twist later in the story, and I wonder whether that's a little twist on that. But either way, Mordecai's got a copy of the law on paper. He gives it to Hathach and says, please show this to Esther. Explain it to her so she doesn't misunderstand the seriousness of the matter, and tell her this: Esther, you must act. You are the only one who can change anything in this situation. You need to approach your husband, the king. You need to implore his favor. You need to beg and plead that he might change his mind, that our people might be saved. And Mordecai knew that this meant Esther would have to reveal who she was after all those years of hiding it. Mordecai knew he was asking Esther to sacrifice herself, to give her own life to save her people. And we shouldn't underestimate how grim this whole situation is. We kid ourselves sometimes, especially with books like Esther and Ruth, that we're reading sort of romantic fairy tales almost. But the atrocities and tragedies of history are very real in this story. They're not happening in some alternative fictional world. Things so unspeakably evil that we can't comprehend what it would mean to live in that situation, or if a law like that was to be declared in our country. And here Mordecai is asking his only family member, as far as we're aware, certainly his only daughter, to sacrifice herself in the vain hope that the Jews might be saved. And if it didn't work, she'd be executed and they'd all still die anyway. But what other option did he have? And so Hathach returns to Esther, bringing Mordecai's message. And in verse 10, we see the severity of the situation is finally kind of ringing true for her. This is a life or death matter. And what Mordecai is asking of her means a death sentence and may even have no effect whatsoever. I don't know if you've ever been in a situation where you've had to call out someone in power. You've had to, maybe a boss or a headmaster or a local politician or something, and you felt that something about their behavior or their decisions was so wrong that you needed to call them out on it. If you've ever been in that situation, you probably know that sense of fear that Esther is feeling about now. That even if you're doing the right thing, even if you tell the truth, speaking truth to power is the phrase we hear sometimes, isn't it? Even when you're doing that, it's an easy thing to say, but a very hard thing to do. Especially when you know that the power in question has the authority to fire you, to demote you, to punish you or humiliate you or to bully you or even to kill you. If you've ever been in that situation, you know it's not one you want to stay in long. And yet that's where Esther finds herself. And so she tells Hathach, go back to Mordecai in the city square and explain this to him. Verse 11, Mordecai, this is crazy. Everyone knows this. I know it. You know it. It's going to get me killed. Unless you are one of the king's officials. The king had 7 friends who could come into his presence at any time. The only time they couldn't was if he was in the bedroom with a woman. Otherwise, they could come into his presence uninvited at literally any time. Only those friends. So even Esther, the queen, saying to Mordecai, look, no one can come into the king's presence unless he has summoned them. Anyone who does automatically receives the death penalty. That is, unless he chooses to extend his gold scepter, a sign of mercy, a sign of welcome and invitation to come, of lenience. Esther says, his mind has been on other things. I've not been summoned to be with the king for a month now. I may not even get as far as the entrance to the inner court before he explodes and orders me killed. I don't know why I haven't seen him. The only chance I have is if he extends that golden scepter, shows me grace and lets me live. But how often has he done that, I wonder? If he's having a bad morning, you served the wrong cereal for breakfast, his shirt's uncomfortable, anything that might set him off and put him in a bad mood, Esther thinks if I catch him at the wrong moment, I'm dead anyway. Who would want to give their life for a lost cause? She may not even get to speak to her unpredictable husband, let alone plead for him to revoke a law that he established. It means exposing to him not only that she's been lying about who she is, but showing him, if he's self-aware enough to see that he's been manipulated, he's a puppet, he's acted unjustly, he's about to commit a genocide. None of that was likely to go down well. No wonder she was scared. And so Hathach, back on the road, goes into the city, finds Mordecai and tells him of Esther's fear-filled response. Mordecai, you can understand this. She's reluctant to do it. You both know it's not going to go well for her. It may even damage your case further. And so Mordecai sends Hathach back to Esther with a chilling truth. Esther, don't misunderstand the gravity of the situation. Don't underestimate the nightmare that is going to play out for you either way. If you are under any kind of illusion, let me just dispel that for you now. A day is coming when every one of our people will be slaughtered in the streets. There will be no escape. There will be nowhere to hide. Innocent men and women and children will be beaten and raped and stoned and decapitated because of our allegiance to Yahweh. And Esther, that means you too. You won't be spared. There will be no pity, no exception for the queen of the empire. You don't know, Esther, who it will be or where it will come from, but on that day, it could be your closest advisor. It could be one of your female servants. It could be Haman himself who decides to hunt you down and kill you. The fact you're in the king's palace will mean nothing on that day. You have to act, because either way, it means death. But if it works, it means deliverance, salvation for God's people. And further, Esther, verse 14, if you keep silence, deliverance will come from some other place. Mordecai's putting on a brave face, I think. He doesn't know where that place will be. Something, you've been in those kind of situations, you don't know the solution, The problem seems so big, but you find yourself saying, I don't know how, but it's going to be all right. Somehow I'm going to get through this. And actually, if someone said to you, well, how are you going to get through it? In what way is it going to be all right? You'd say, I don't know. I don't know yet. But it will be okay. Maybe that's where Mordecai has a bit of optimism. Maybe it is an expression of faith that God will preserve his people. I don't know, he says, but it will be okay. And then he asks that question, poses that question, a favourite of so many of us who treasure this book. Who knows, Esther? Perhaps you have come to your royal position for such a time as this. And we like to think of this verse, I think, in quite a romantic way. God has called me to this moment in my life so he can use me in a meaningful way to change the world. And all the puzzle pieces are suddenly going to connect and make sense, and I will realize my purpose and my destiny, and it will all come together. What's Mordecai really saying to Esther in this? When he says, perhaps you've come to your royal position for such a time as this. Esther, perhaps you've been made queen in order that you might die to save your people, that you might risk your life, that you may go through the most extreme sense of fear you have yet felt in your troubled life. Esther, maybe the Lord has called you to die. Maybe you've been put in this position for such a time as this. I'm not sure they were thinking of glory and everything fitting together and Esther coming out the hero in this moment. I think in their desperation, in Mordecai's desperation, Esther, I'm sorry to say, it might be that you've been called to this position in order that you might die in this way, but that there might be hope through it. It starts to sound familiar to us. That all the challenges and the privileges that have brought her to this point are so that she can risk her life for an outside chance that her people might just be saved. I wonder if she had one of those moments where her whole life kind of sort of flashes before her eyes. Being born into a pagan kingdom, losing her mum and her dad, becoming an orphan, being brought up by Mordecai, being this pretty young Jewish girl, hiding her identity, keeping her head down in an empire that was already suspicious of her race. Taken against her will from her only family into life in the palace, having no real choice but to give her virginity to a pagan king, a really terrible thing for a Jewish girl to have had to consider, becoming his queen and now lonely. 5 years into her marriage, the king's distracted. She hasn't even seen her husband for a month. Distance between them. All of this, Mordecai said, maybe all of this has come that your life might end in a very difficult way. Had fate or God ordered all of this just so that she could die trying to save a nation from a tyrant? Mordecai's words are not easy, charming, romantic, quote-worthy things to put on our bathroom walls or above our kitchen sink. It was a huge responsibility placed on Esther's shoulders. And so she sends one last message to Mordecai. Okay, I will do it. I will go see the king, even though it's against the law, even though, well, if I perish, I perish. So be it. But Mordecai, you must do this for me. Gather every Jew that you can find in the city, and get them together as quickly as you can, and together fast for me. Give up food and drink. Do not eat or drink anything for 3 days, 3 nights. It's a big ask, but it's a long time to go without a nibble. An intolerable time to go without a drink in the hot Susa sunshine. But Esther says, I will do the same, and my female servants. We can't be with you, but we will fast as well. An indication for us again that Mordecai and Esther realize that they are in a spiritual battle, and there is only one true solution to this, and it is that Yahweh, God, moves. We don't really know how much Esther understood of what was going on, but we know that her instincts here were right and good, weren't they? If I'm going to step into the battle, I need all the help I can get. If this is a spiritual war, I need spiritual wisdom, spiritual protection, spiritual guidance. I need the God of Mordecai. I need the God of my mum and dad. Some of us worry for our children, especially if we have grown-up children who know the faith and yet for some reason or another have walked away from God or failed to claim the faith for themselves. Maybe we should pray. I don't say this lightly, but maybe we should pray that they meet such a trial that it draws them to say, what would mum or dad have done in this situation? I need to pray to their God. I need a solution, and it's outside of me. All those seeds that you've planted as praying parents, as worshipping parents, as parents, bring their children regularly to church when you can. Pray that they would be seeds that are planted in the hearts of our children. That if not now, then someday soon they would cry out to God. So Esther does what is insightful and wise, something that can't be done alone. We're not told they prayed, but it's kind of implied in the fasting. We're not told how they understand God's part in all of this, but they humble themselves before him at a time of unimaginable crisis. And Esther says, pray for me, Mordecai. Pray that this works. I'll pray too. Let's see if Yahweh will not yet deliver his people, as he promised in the ancient scriptures. See if he won't rescue us from death as he did our ancestors in our parents' stories. And so verse 17, Mordecai acts. He gets up from his place of grief. He obeys Esther, we're told. Strong words. For us, in times of crisis, there is a time to stop grieving and to start acting. And that first action might just be this: gathering God's people together to fast and pray. Getting on our knees and waiting together and trusting that God would move. Trusting him for healing, for rescue, for salvation. And here's where we're coming into end. Returning to that question of Mordecai's. Who knows, Esther? Perhaps you've come to your royal position for such a time as this. And I want us to see Jesus. He also faced death to save a covenant people from the very real threat of Satan, of a great enemy. He prayed and wept in the Garden of Gethsemane, pleading that that cup of judgment, the death that was awaiting him, might somehow be taken away. And yet he concluded, did he not? If I perish, I perish. That is the plan. The King of heaven, as the crown of thorns were pressed into the flesh of his head, perhaps was assured by those words, you have come to your royal position for such a time as this. Not the crown we might have expected the King of heaven to be wearing. And what was written on the sign that hung over his head on the cross, the King of the Jews, as nails suspended him there, dying. In the incarnation, becoming one of us, in going to the cross, Jesus wasn't thinking for one moment that this was about his own glory. We're told clearly in Philippians 2, in that beautiful poem that Paul has written down for us there, that he considered equality with God something not to be grasped, but he made himself nothing. He was willing to endure the experience, the humiliation, the challenges, and the privileges of life with flesh and blood, so that he could give that life. Not for an outside chance, but for a guarantee that he would save all who turned to him. Esther's situation, not perfectly, but I think in many ways, points to what Jesus did perfectly go through for us. What he did face, and what he did feel, and what he did endure to save all who would turn to him in faith. And what about us? We're sometimes bold enough to apply this verse to ourselves. Maybe God has put me here in this situation for such a time as this. It's a good thing to reflect on. It is a good thing to ask. But often we think it this way. Maybe God's put me here to be a hero, to endure, to stand up. We're sometimes, thinking, well, this is my time to make a difference, my time to shine. Maybe we hear the faint echoes of future praise ringing in our ears. Wasn't he brave? Wasn't she courageous to do that? God put her there for such a time as this. But when we've thought about Esther's royal position, that position of privilege, and we consider how high the stakes were for her, the risk of her life, the risk of many lives, Think about the position as Christians that we've been put in. Right now, today, there are hundreds and thousands of people in our country who will not enter the life with God when they die, but they face hell, eternal death, existence outside of God's grace and the presence of God, the God who made and loves them. This year in our own towns, scores of people will die outside the grace of God. Some of them will die never having clearly heard the gospel, not understanding at all that there is a God who loves them and who sent his Son to die for them, that they may be forgiven their sins, that their debt may be paid, that they may receive forgiveness and life and joy. We have been put in a royal position for such a time as this. 1 John 3, see what great love the Father has lavished on us. If you're a believer here this morning, this is about you. See what great love the Father has lavished on us. We should be called children of God. And that is what we are. Romans 8, the Spirit himself testifies with our spirit that we are God's children. Now, if we are children, then we are heirs. We are heirs of God and co-heirs with Christ, if indeed we share in his sufferings, in order that we may also share in his glory. Do you get this? You are a chosen people. You are the children of God. You have been brought into his family. You are, Peter says, a royal priesthood. Royal. Maybe you have been put in this royal position for such a time as this. A holy nation, God's special possession, that you may declare the praises of him who called you out of darkness and into his wonderful light. We're not called out of darkness into the light of God and then promised this easy life in this world, are we? Maybe, just maybe, we have come into our royal position as chosen, loved children of God, as ambassadors of King Jesus for such a time as this, to look out on the world around us and say, there are hundreds of thousands whose lives are in danger, who will face death without the knowledge, the saving knowledge of Jesus Christ. Maybe that's why we've put here for such a time as this. Maybe that's why God has brought you here this morning. That's why he's given you your life and your house and your neighbours and your car and your schools and your situations, your church, your family, that he's brought you here this morning, or that he has kept you away this morning and you are watching this on a video later and you are in that moment at this time. Because there are many who don't know Jesus yet, who are facing death, who need salvation, who need that great rescue. And that might come at a cost to us, don't you? That this should be a challenge for us. That God has given you the life that you have, that you might testify to his grace. Maybe it's the good things, the promotions, the pay rises, the clever children, the good health that you have, the wonderful good looks that you have. That was what it was for Esther, wasn't it? She was a babe. That's how she got to be queen. Maybe God has given you those blessings in your life in order that you might give your life away to see others come to know salvation. Or maybe, and perhaps more profoundly, trusting in the providence of God, as we're learning more about in this series, it is your losses and your illnesses and your suffering, your shyness, your gentle spirit. They might be the very means through which God uses you to hold out eternal life to another. God has put you in this village, in this church, in this time, called you to this family and this room today, that we might play our parts, that we might say, for such a time as this, God has called me to play my part in his plan of salvation. Not for our glory, although there is glory to come. We were promised, if we share in his sufferings, we will also share in his glory. I don't want to be the pessimist or the negative one, but I want us to take this verse and start to think, Lord, how do I really apply this wonderful verse to my life? What have you called me to? What have you put me in this position for? Not for my glory, not so that I can finally be satisfied that all the puzzle pieces fit together and I understand the big picture, but so that I might play my part in seeing people who are lost and going to hell come to know the saving grace of Jesus Christ. Should we pray? Lord, there's a lot in these verses again and in this story to challenge us, to shape us, to change us. And Lord, I don't for 1 minute preach these words as if I have got it all together and that I have figured this out and that this is the shape of my life. And so I pray for myself and for each one of us here and for those watching later or listening later on the video, Lord, that you would help us to understand the part that we play in your salvation plan is not first and foremost or even at all for our glory, but it is for yours. Help us to trust your providential hand, to celebrate and thank you for the good gifts that we have, but to recognize as well that even in the struggles, the difficulties, even in the moments where we might even face our own mortality, Lord, that you have put us in these positions that we might bring glory to your name, that we might reach out to those who are lost and hurting, those who need grace, those who need to know that Jesus died for them and that you love them. Lord, help us to play our part in your great plan. And Lord, give us the privilege of leading others to faith in Jesus, that you might have put us just where we are for such a time as that. We pray these things in your precious and wonderful name, Jesus. Amen.